Alright, so let's look at how we can use Firebase to take something like a score or a number of points from a user that's logged in to our web page and then save that score or number of points to a Firebase database. So in order to do that, we'd need to set up authentication in Firebase so that we can authenticate the user. In this case, we're going to use email and password to do that. And then obviously we need a web front end, so we need a form for them to sign up and sign in. We need the JavaScript to manage that authentication. That's going to come back to our Firebase authentication with our account. We also need some sort of interface for the game, and in this video I'm going to use examples that I've already done in other videos, both for authentication and for a JavaScript quiz that gives the user a number of points. And then we're going to set up a Firestore database in Firebase and look at the JavaScript for saving that score from the quiz to our Firestore database so that we can calculate a highest score and display the current score and the highest score to the user in the web HTML front end. So that's what we're going to demonstrate in this video. So to start with, I'm actually going to come to my GitHub page with all my repositories here, and I'm going to go to the easy authentication code. That's linked in the description as well. And I'm not going to go through all this again, but there is a video elsewhere on my channel that explains all of this code. For now though, I'm just going to copy it and paste it into a new HTML document so that I'm good to go with the authentication part of my code. Now this isn't going to work directly from my GitHub. Obviously we need a Firebase config object for your particular Firebase account. So I'm not going to go through how to set up the Firebase account in detail, but if you haven't got an account and an app in Firebase that you can get a config object for, you'll need to set that up. So very quickly, you'll create a project. And then you'll create the app. Then you'll set up the authentication and select email and password and enable that method of authentication. And then we can create our Firestore database. We'll just click Create Database, select our region. We'll start it in test mode today and press Create. So there's our database ready to collect data. Let's go to the project settings. Now that we've set up our Firebase, we can come to the config here, and there's our Firebase config object. I'm just going to copy that, and then we can paste it into this code that I've got for my repository. And let's just tidy that up as well. And now we're ready to use the authentication code that I have explained in another video. So if I test that out, I'll just make up an email. We'll say kp@kp.com. It's not a real email, and I'll just use test123 as the password. I'm going to say I'm going to sign up. And the account's been created. And then I can see the secret information for people that are authenticated. I could sign out and sign in again, and so the authentication is working. So that's the first step. And again, if you want further explanation on that, look at the video about that authentication code. But we've managed authentication so far. I'm now going to get the quiz. Again, this is from another video and another repository on GitHub of mine. So coming back to my GitHub, I just click on the quiz repository here. And here I've got some code for a very simple quiz. So looking at my code for the quiz here, there's just a little bit of HTML. There's not very much to it in terms of the HTML, but I'm just going to copy that HTML for the quiz, and I'm going to pop it in here in the HTML for the authentication that I just copied across, and I'm going to paste it inside the secret content div, which is only showing once the user has signed in. Now I don't need these messages anymore, so I'll delete those. I'm going to keep the sign out button. That is important that I keep the sign out button there because I want to be able to sign out and sign back in again as different users. So I'll keep that in there, but I'm just going to paste in the HTML for the quiz. And then I'm also going to paste in the JavaScript. So just come back to my code here. I don't need the script tags because I've already got those in my other code. I'm just going to select and copy all of that code for the quiz. Of course, you can replace this with your own logic for a quiz or a game that you have done. And we'll still look at how we can get the points from that game and save them to the database. That's what we're going to look at in this video. But to start with, I'm just using what I've already created. So I'm just going to paste this quiz JavaScript underneath the JavaScript for the authentication and signing in and signing out functions. But I'm just keeping it above the event listeners just because that's how I like to do it. I like to keep the event listeners at the bottom. So just coming back to the HTML at the top here, you can see there's one thing I definitely need to change. I've got onClick and then calling a function with onClick for when I click the button. That's fine with a really simple page and a nice little shortcut, but it's not going to work once I've got these asynchronous functions happening in a more complex HTML web page. So I'm just going to delete that onClick and I'm going to put an ID in instead, just like my other buttons there. I'm just going to call it submit button for now. And then I need to, like I've done with the other ones, make a variable for that submit button. Let's copy sign out button as a template, then just change that to submit, and then make sure I'm getting the correct ID there of the submit button. And then once I've made that variable for the submit button, I can then come down to the bottom and make an event listener for it. So submit button dot add event listener, and then we're waiting for the event of the click. And we're just going to go to the same submit function that I had before, but this time I'm just using the event listener rather than the onClick method inside the HTML. It won't work now that I'm making the JavaScript more complex, so just tidying that up as a way of just helping to connect that quiz code that I had before and the authentication code that I had, and now just combining them. So hopefully now if I test that, I've got a nice simple web page where I can sign in with the email and password that I set up before. Then once I'm signed in, or signed up as a new account if I want, it's going to take me to the quiz. So not that message that I had before, but it takes me straight to the quiz. And I've still got that sign out button there, so I could sign out and sign in as a different user if I wanted. But now if I complete the quiz, that's all going to work. And at the end of it, it'll tell me that my score is 3. But what we're going to look at in this demo is how do I then take the score, which sure, it's there in the JavaScript and it's showing up in the browser, but how do I take that and actually get it saved in the database, number one, and then how do I query the database to sort the data and show me what my highest score is if I've done multiple attempts at that same quiz. And the first thing I'm going to need to do to get that happening is I'm going to need to come up here to where I have imported various methods from the Firebase library, and I'm going to need to import a few more. So I'm going to say import, and I'm going to import some things, this time not from the authentication library or just from the Firebase app library, but this time it's going to be from, I'm going to copy this and paste it, but I'm going to change the Firebase authentication to the Firebase Firestore because we're using the Firestore database, and to save things to the database and to query the database we're going to need a few functions from that library that we can use in our app. So firstly, obviously we're going to need to get a get Firestore just to sort of initiate our database in the first place, and I'm also going to need to import the doc method. That's really important. That's for setting out, giving the database information in the form of what we call documents in this NoSQL database, sort of like a bunch of data, sort of equivalent to a table in a more traditional database, but sort of not really as well. So it's got a number of fields, key value pairs, but they're called documents in Firebase. So we definitely need to import that. We also need to import collection, sort of a data structure where we have a whole lot of different documents that we can all put together. We're going to need to import setDoc to sort of put the data into the database in the first place. Okay, and then we're going to need to query our database, so we're going to import query as well. We're also going to import getDocs That's with an S on the end, get docs, and that's for also allowing us to query the docs from our database. Once we've got the data from the database, we want to order it. So I'm going to import this order by as well, because we want to order it by particular type of data and put it to ascending or descending. And I want to import this one as well, limit, so that we can limit it to just a certain number of bits of data that we want to get out. When we get that higher score, we just want one score to come out of our database. We don't want the whole list. Alright, so now that I have imported all of the functionality from the Firebase Firestore library that I need, I can now go about actually going and using these methods in the JavaScript code that I'm going to write to do what I want to do. Firebase does quite a lot of the heavy lifting for us behind the scenes, so now I can take advantage of that functionality, write some JavaScript functions, and get things happening between my front end and the database. So the first thing I'll need to do, if I come down here and look at my existing code for the quiz, you can see that I've got this update function, and what that does is it just checks whether I'm at the end of the quiz or not. And if I'm at the end of the quiz, in other words, if I've run out of questions from my question array, and I do go through all this in the quiz video, and if you're using your own quiz in here, then it might be a different sort of setup. But the point is, when I get to the end of the quiz, I then decide that this is the score. I've got the current score that I'm keeping track of, the score variable, and I tell the user what the score is. The problem with this is that the score variable, if I come back to the beginning where I defined it, the score variable is defined using var. So it's a variable that can keep constantly changing, but it's going to be really difficult for me to do anything with that in terms of passing that variable into other functions. So in order to do that, I really want it to be a constant variable that's going to be able to be identified throughout my code and be able to be passed into other functions, which is what I need it to do. So what I'm actually going to do, I'm actually going to create another function here, and I'm going to call it complete quiz. So in other words, this function is designed to be running or working once my quiz is complete. And I'm going to take this bit here, this telling the user what their score is in the HTML. I'm going to cut that out and I'm going to put that into my complete quiz function. So now if I run out of questions and I'm at the end of the quiz, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this complete quiz function and say, yep, I want to run that. And I'm going to come down here and I'm going to say your score is score. And so that's going to take whatever their score is, that score variable. If they've got 3 out of 3, for example, it's going to take it and display it in the HTML. That's what that line of code does. But I'm also going to want to create a constant variable called, I'm going to call this one final score, and I'm going to set that to be equal to the score variable that I've used already. So this variable that's changing and it's sort of incrementing or adding 1 to the user's score every time they get a question right, that's sort of in flux, that's changing. But I want a constant variable. A constant variable is not supposed to be changed. So once I set it, it's supposed to stay that way and be storing that same data throughout the entire instance of me running the app. Of course, it can be different. You know, if I come in and I do the quiz another time, then I'm going to get a different final score if I do the quiz another time. But as long as I'm running it, that constant variable should be the same. It should set that final score and keep it that way. And what that means is that I can then pass this constant final score variable into my other functions. And that's exactly what I want to do. I want to create an asynchronous function here. And I'm going to call this one save user score. And that function, this asynchronous function, I'm going to call once I've completed the quiz. So save user score, I'll call that function once I've finished the quiz, and I'm going to pass in the final score variable as an argument for my save user score function. So when I say an argument, I mean that's the number. So let's say I get 3 out of 3. That's the number that I'm going to pass in to be using as the score that I want to then pass on to the database and save in the database. So to make it really clear, I'm just going to call this variable score parameter so that we know that's what it is. This is the parameter for the function, which kind of acts like, like X, like algebra. Like this is the placeholder for what I want to do with that information in my function. But then when I actually call the function, the actual data that I'm going to pass into that function is going to be my final score, which I've set as this constant variable, which is obviously going to be set to whatever the score is when I finish the quiz. So it's a bit confusing because I've got multiple variables that all relate to the user's score, but they all have a different purpose in the way that they're being used in the JavaScript code here. So this one is the parameter that I'm using in my function. That's later going to be the argument, and that's the variable that's incrementing every time the user gets a point correct. But at the end of the quiz, we turn that into the const variable, and we pass it in as an argument to our save user score function, which has this parameter in there that we're gonna play with now. But before we do that, a couple of things we need to do first in this function. Firstly, let's make a variable called user, and that is going to be the auth.currentUser. Current user, and that is just. That's important to keep it in the function. You might be thinking, why do I not have this outside the function? But basically, as our app gets a little bit more complex, we want to be checking that we have a user and that they're currently logged in and everything every time we call a new function, because it's starting to get a bit more dynamic and the user might be signing in and signing out. So every time we run a function, we want to be just checking, yep, are they still signed in, and who have we got as a authenticated user that we're actually dealing with here. And this auth thing here, that auth variable, that actually refers up earlier here to where we made this variable here, where we're using getAuth again from the Firebase Authentication library. That reminds me, we need to set that up for our Firestore as well. So I'm going to make a new variable at the top here, and I'm just going to call it db, and we're going to set that equal to getFirestore. And again, we just pass in the app. So this app variable, that of course is our Firebase config. So that's setting it to our actual app that we've made in our Firebase account. We're initializing that through the main Firebase library, and we're setting that to the app variable, and then we're just passing that into our authentication and to our database, which means we can use all of the authentication and all of the Firebase Firestore stuff later on. So we've already used the authentication a little bit. Now we're using it again, but I'm about to, again, I want to save the score into the Firebase Firestore database. So now that I've set this user variable, I'm going to make an if statement here to check that the user is logged in. So like any if statement, we have the word if and then some condition, and then we'll run some code if that condition is true. So the condition I'm checking whether it's true or not is just this user. So what that means is there actually a user object that exists? In other words, is the user logged in? And if they are, then we'll run some code. If they are not, then I'll just log in the console something like user not signed in. But of course, if they are logged in, then I want to take the data, which is their score, and I want to put it into the database. So to do that, I'm just going to make a variable first and call it score.ref. So that's the reference for this document that we're going to create in our database that contains the user's score. And so that's what we're going to do now. We're going to set a document into the database. So this variable is like the reference for how we want to do that. And so we're going to use the doc method because we are creating a document. But it's a bit more complicated this time because we're going to put it into a collection as well. So what inside that collection, we're sort of going backwards here, but we need to refer to the database. Firstly, we need, obviously all of it's going into the database. There's different ways you can do this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a collection called users, and then there's going to be a series of documents in that collection, which is going to be the user IDs. So the user, whoever they are, in Firebase, once they're authenticated, they will automatically be assigned a UID or a user ID by Firebase. So we're going to list what those are in our users collection, but then as a sub collection of each of those users documents, we want to have the sub collection called scores, and that's where we're going to store all of the users' scores, keeping in mind that they might have multiple scores because they might do the quiz multiple times. And now that I've set that up, I'm going to do a try catch situation. So I'll try some sort of code, and if that doesn't work, I'm going to try and catch any errors. If there is an error, then if there's an error there, then all I'll do is I'll just console.error, and we'll just say that there's been an error saving the score, and then just put whatever that error is. So we'll set that up for the error handling, and if the code does work though, which hopefully it does, what we'll do is we'll say await, and we're going to use this setDoc method from Firebase, Firestore. And what that does is it's going to actually put the data into the database. You can use addDoc as well, but because of the way we're doing it this time, it's got these rules about how you put data into the database. And so for that reason, in this particular case, setDoc is going to work better. addDoc won't actually work the way that we're doing it here. So setDoc, and then we're going to get that setDocRef variable that we put in before, and then comma, and our fancy brackets, because we want to put in a key value pair here, which is going to be the score, and then this score parameter that we set up earlier. In other words, whatever is being passed into the function. So that's kind of like a placeholder variable for now. But of course, what that would mean if we're actually calling and running this function is it's whatever we've passed in here. So if your score is 3, then it's going to set that score to the final score variable and pass in 3 into this function. And so it'll save 3 into the database as the value under the score key for the document that we're putting into our Firestore database. And if that all works, then it's just console.log and say something like score saved successfully. Okay, it's always good to stop and test these things out. So I'm just saving the code there. Let's refresh, and I'm going to do the quiz again. 4, 6, and 8, and score is 3, and the score is saved successfully, apparently. So let's check that out in our Firebase database now. If I come to my Firestore database, let's have a look. So you can see how it's working. I've got this users collection, and in that I could have a whole lot of documents. At the moment, the document is my user ID for the user I was signed in as. And underneath that user, I've got the sub-collection here called scores. And in my scores sub-collection, I've got documents. Now, there's only one field in this document at the moment, but I could have more. I could have a timestamp. I could have all sorts of other things. So a document can have lots of different bits of data. It doesn't have to be as simple as this and just have one, but that's the way it is in this case. Just the score with the number that's been passed in from the HTML because I got 3 out of 3, and that's been converted to that final score const variable and then passed into my save score function and put into the database. So that is all working great. To test this further, let me just sign out, and then I'll create, let's use this one, a different account. So I'm going to sign up with a different user, and then that's my new user. So let's refresh the page as my new user. And this time I think I might get, let's get a couple wrong. Let's say that that's 8 rather than 4. Let's say that that is 8 again. So I'm just going to get 1 out of 3 this time. So there's 1. Score saved successfully into the database. So now if I refresh my Firestore database here, we should see that I've now, if I come back here, I've now got two different users. So one user in the sub-collection scores has the score of 3, but the other user, if I go into the sub-collection scores, there's a document there that shows that they've only got 1. So different users, different scores. Again, let's to demonstrate it. Staying in as the same user, this time I will get the questions correct. So I'll go 4, 6, and 8. And so now I've got 3 out of 3. So now in my database, that same user in the sub-collection scores has got a document that shows they scored 3 and a document that shows that they scored 1. So same multiple scores for the same user. So now we want to come to the next bit. Now that we've got our Firestore database, we've written the function for saving the latest score to that Firestore database. So the next thing is we want to write a function that allows us to calculate the highest score for a particular user. All right, so it's an asynchronous function again. And let's call it get highest score. Highest score. And in this function, once again, we're going to make a constant variable called user, which is going to be, we're going to use the authentication library and just say current user. So as we did before, again, we want that inside the function, not as a variable outside the function, because we want to be running it and checking it every time we run the function. So again, they might have signed in and signed out. So let's make sure that they are signed in, that we've got the correct user every time we run the function. And again, I'm going to use the if statement. If a condition is true, then we will run some code. If that condition is not true, and the condition is going to be, does the user exist? If they don't, then we're going to console log, I'm going to say user not signed in. But hopefully they will be. And the way to check that is just to put this user variable in there. So if there is a user object and the user does exist, they are there, they have signed in, then we can write our code. And then we can run the code that we're about to write. So we want to get the highest score. So I'm going to create a variable which is going to be called scoreRef, because what we're actually wanting to do here is wanting to query the database. And so what we're going to look at, the particular part of the database that we're going to look at, is of course pretty much the same as what we set up here. We're looking for this scores sub-collection, which is going to be part of the user ID document, because we've made this document for each user, inside the collection called users. And we want to get that scores data so we know all of the users' scores. So it's basically the same as this, but I'm not going to get this doc. I'm just going to get this collection and the document and the sub collection underneath it. So I'm just going to copy all of that and paste it in here to my scores ref. So I'm getting this scores sub collection, and I'm going to get all of it for now. But I'm just passing or storing that inside the scores ref variable for now. Then I'm going to make another variable. It's going to call it Q, and that's going to represent my actual query. Okay, so I'm going to use the query method from my Firestore library from Firebase and do a query. So what is that query? Well, it's the scoreRef variable that I've just made. So that's the part of the database that I want to query. And the way I'm wanting to query it in this case is I've got all my scores here, all of the scores that are attributed to the user that has signed in. And what I want to do is I want to order them. So I'll use my order by method that I've imported from the Firestore library. And I want to order them by score. So not scores. Remember that scores is the sub collection where all of their scores are. And in that sub collection, I've got these different fields. These documents, and the documents have fields in them, which is just, let me find where I set it. I've got this key value pair of score and then whatever their score is. So that's what I'm wanting to order it by. I'm wanting to order it by this key in my key value pairs. So I'm going to order it by score, and I want it to be in descending order. So that's just DESC, standing short for descending, in quotes as well as the second part there. So I'm ordering the scores in descending order based on this score key that I've put into the database to store all the users' scores. Okay, now once I've done that, remember, because this is the highest score that I'm wanting to get, once I've got, I don't want to list all of the scores, I just want to see that top one. So I'm going to use my limit, so I'm going to limit the number of results I get just to 1. So I'm just going to get that top score, once I've ordered them in descending order, that top one which should be the highest score that the user has. So that's my query, and I'm storing it in this variable Q. So let's go about actually using this query, and I'm going to do that again with a try and catch. So I'll try some code and then catch some errors, and if there is an error, then what I'll do is I'll log that error, console.error, and I'll just say there's an error fetching the scores, and then I'll just say get the computer to say whatever that error is. Okay, but assuming there's not an error, what am I actually trying to do? Well, sorry, but again, it's another variable. We're going to make a variable here called query snapshot. So a snapshot of the database as it is at the time that I run the function. And that is going to equal my query. So I'm going to use this getDocs method that I imported earlier from Firestore. And in fact, I need to await, because it's asynchronous. So let's do that. I'm going to say await getDocs, and then it's just that query, that Q variable that stores the query that I want to do on my database. So because I'm wanting to get documents, I'm using the getDocs method. The query that I'm doing is that Q1 that I've described earlier, and I'm waiting for that to happen. Once it's happened, I'm going to want to return that data. In fact, that reminds me, if it doesn't happen, if this doesn't work, so if there's an error, I actually want to return null, and you might see why later. But basically, I want to return the correct data, but even if I don't, if there's an error of some sort, I still want the function to return something, because it's the code I'm going to write later is going to expect something to be returned from this function. So I need something to be returned, either null if there's an error, or the actual correct data if the code has worked, or if it's worked the way that it's supposed to. So next thing up here is I'm just going to make an if statement. Again, if there's a condition that's either true or not. If that condition is true, then I'll run some code. And if it's not, then I'll run some other code. And again, that'll be another error. So I'm just handling all these errors here. So if this was the case, I'd just console.log and say no scores found, or something like that. The condition that is either true or not is whether we have this, this query snapshot. So is there any data there, in other words? In other words, do they have scores? Because if the user's logging in for the first time, then there's probably not going to be any scores there. So we need to handle that. That's when we'd get no scores found. But if it's not empty, if the snapshot is not empty, so query snapshot.empty not, and the JavaScript for not is exclamation mark. So, just like in high school when people say, that's a nice jumper, not. That's kind of the same thing. It's like, is the snapshot empty? Not means, is it not empty? In other words, is there something there? In other words, is there a score there? And if there is a score there, we're going to do our query. And if there's not a score there, we're going to say no scores found in the console. Okay, but assuming that there is a list of scores there, then we're going to want to return the highest score. So I'm going to say return. Unfortunately, this query is not just going to straight give us the highest score. It's going to give us the data, but it's going to give us quite a bit there. And all we want is, well, we want the docs. But of all of that data, we just want the first doc there. So keeping in mind that we're getting an array, we're just saying we want that first item. So remember, we start counting from 0. So it's that first item of our array, and it's the data that we actually want from it. And so that's going to give us this data, which is everything that's in our scores sub-collection. And it's not a very complicated sub-collection at the moment. It's just got that key value pair of score and then the user score. So I'm going to say .score. So, and it's just going to return that, but for the highest score. And that's what's going to come out of our function, is the user's highest score. Of course, if they don't have any scores, it's going to give us no score found. And then let's actually also say here, return null, so that the function still returns something. If there's an error of some sort getting the scores, then it's going to say that and return null, but it's always going to return something. And if the user's not signed in, then it'll return null from this function as well. Okay, and it's important to return something because now the next function where we actually use this data, we're gonna get the data that's been returned from this get highest score function. Before I go any further though, I just want to check that this function is actually working. I've written it, and then I'm going to use what is returned from this function in my last function, which is to display the highest score to the user. But before I go ahead and start writing that function, let's actually test that it's working. So I'm going to just put this console.log in here, and I'm just going to copy this thing that I'm trying to return, and just check that I can actually log that in the console so that the whole thing is working, that the query is working, everything is as I want it to be. Now, of course, just because I'm saying that I want these things to happen in the function, it's not necessarily going to occur in the browser unless I actually call the function. So I've declared the function, but I haven't called it anywhere. So for now, let's just come up to this complete quiz function. So when I've finished the quiz, and let's just call my get highest score function, get highest score, just to test that it's working. If something's wrong, I want to find out sooner rather than later. So let's just give it a test. Always important to do. So I'm signed in. I'm going to say 4, 6, and 8. And when I press submit now, it's going to run the complete quiz function. And it says score saved successfully, but you've also got this 3 at the top here. And I know, because I wrote the function, that 3 represents the highest score. So that's great. So now I'm ready to write my next function. Now that we've got the quiz, saving the score to the database, and we've also managed to write a function that calculates the highest score, the last function is to display that highest score to the user. So to do that, I actually first need to come all the way back up to my HTML, and I want to create a little space for it up here. So I'm just going to I might just make this an H3 actually, and I'm going to give it an ID of, I'll call it high score message or something like that. And I'm just going to keep it empty, this H3, so that I can put in the user's highest score and sort of inject that into the HTML with my JavaScript function. So firstly, where I've put some variables here, I'm just going to make another one. Const, let's call it a high score message. Is that what was that the ID? Yeah, high score message equals document. Now I've been using query selector. Document doc. Of course, you can use get element by ID as well. It'll work just the same, but just to keep it consistent, I'll keep using query selector here. But get element by ID obviously works just as well. If you are using query selector, you just need the hashtag to indicate that it's an ID that we're referring to. And I'll just call it high score message. And so now I've got a variable that I can work with in my displaying the highest score function, which I will write now. So again, it's going to be an asynchronous function, and we'll call it display highest score. or display high score or something like that. Display high score, and then let's get started. So this is probably going to be the easiest of the three functions. And again, we'll just do a try catch situation. So we'll try some code. If it doesn't work, we'll try and catch the error and run some code if there is an error. Console.log, just say fails to get the highest score or something like that. Okay, but assuming there's no error, we'll just make a variable, a constant variable called high score or something like that, and we will await this function that we've done up here, the get highest score function. So we're going to await that and see what it returns. Remember that this get highest score function was written to return some data. So here what we're doing in our display highest score is we're waiting for that function to run, and then we're seeing what data it returns. And hopefully it returns something. But again, let's put an if statement in there. We'll wait for the condition to be true. If the condition is true that it returns something, then we'll run some code. And again, if it doesn't return anything, then we will, let's actually display the error on the web page itself. So I've got this high score message variable which represents that h3, which is empty at the moment in my HTML. So let's put some text in there. Content equals no scores available, because it might be that the reason we'd get the else statement triggering here is it might just be that they haven't registered a score yet. So we don't want a message that says failed to do something or anything. We just want to say there's no scores available, because it's the reason for it is probably that they haven't registered a higher score. So that's if this condition is not met. The condition, by the way, is that there should be some data returned from our get highest score function. So we're going to say if high score is not equal to null. Okay. If it is equal to null, then we'll come down here and say no scores available. But if it's not equal to null, then we'll run our code. And that code obviously is going to be, we want the high score message to have some text in it, that empty h3, we're going to put some text in it, and that text will just be saying highest score, colon, and then we will add this high score variable, which we've made up here, which is going to be whatever the data is that is returned from our get highest score function. Okay, so now that we've finished that function, we want to test it, but of course, right now, if we were to run this, remember that at no point so far have we actually called this display high score function. So we do actually need to call the function at some point. So the best place to call it, I think, is going to be, let's come up to our check auth state. And if the user is signed in, so in other words, once the user is signed in, that's when we want to call it there. So it's called display high score. We'll call the function once the user has authenticated. Obviously, this display high score relies on the user being logged in, because we're wanting to display the high score of that particular user. So they do have to be authenticated first before this function will work. But once they are logged in, we're going to show them their high score even before they start the quiz, so that they know what their high score is, so that they know what the bar is that they're trying to beat the next time they do the quiz or the next time they play the game or whatever it is that you're doing. So you might be thinking, well, we're calling our display high score function, but where have we called our get highest score function? Well, remember that in our display high score function, we're waiting for the data that's returned from get highest score. So in a way, that's where we're actually calling the get highest score function at that point. So if I'm calling this when the user signs in, this function will in turn actually call the get highest score function and get that data from our query of the database, return it, and then that'll be displayed on the web page as we have asked it to do with our display high score function. Of course, remembering that our save user score was a function that we called here when we completed the quiz. And I actually called the get high score one there as well, but I can delete that because I was only doing that just for testing. So when the user completes the quiz, we'll call the save user score function, pass their final score in as an argument to that function so it knows what data it's saving into the database. But then right from the beginning, when the user signs in, that's when we'll call our display high score function and show them what their highest score is. So let's save it, moment of truth. Let's test this out. If I refresh the page, yep, it signs them in and it tells them what their highest score is. So if I were to sign in as someone else, Derek. Derek at derek.com, for example. Let me sign up as Derek. Okay, now it says no scores available because Derek hasn't registered a higher score yet. Okay, but let's test it. If I say that that's 4, but let's get the next 2 wrong. Now my score is 1. If I refresh the page here, now it's telling me that my highest score is 1. If I were to get 2 correct this time, out of 3, now it's 2. And if I refresh the page now, then it's telling me that my highest score is 2. So it's keeping track of what my highest score is, even though it's still registering other scores in the database as well, and registering the score every time I do the quiz, but it's keeping track of what my highest score is. So that's all the functionality working. As a final step, of course, you can, let's get rid of that CSS, and I'm going to paste in some CSS from elsewhere, but I'm not going to go through the CSS in this video because that's not the point of it, it's the functionality. But any CSS that you want to do can just make the whole thing look a bit nicer, obviously. And you can play around with the looks and styles and things like that. So if you were to go to my GitHub and copy the code, that's why you would see it looking like this. It's because I've put that CSS in. But of course, feel free to tinker and play with the CSS as you choose. That's not the point of this video. So hopefully that tutorial or that demo will be enough for you to take this idea or copy the code that I've used as a starting point, if you like, and then take that and do your own things with it. So if you've got your own quiz, your own game, you can use the same logic, or you could do different queries in Firebase. It doesn't have to be the highest score query. You could do other sort of queries as well. But hopefully that gives you a base as a starting point for playing with Firebase and learning a bit more about it and learning how to take that HTML front end and take data from that to the database and back the other way so that we can display it and also query the data from the database at the same time. The key thing about this is that we're using authentication as well as that database. So we're signing the user in, and then by looking at their user ID, we're actually able to connect the data that we're getting from what the user's doing on the web page and storing that data to their user ID, so that when we query the database as well, we can say not just what's the data in the database overall, but what is the data that actually relates to this specific user. So hopefully that's useful. Play around with it. Copy the code if you want. It's in the description. The other videos on authentication and this simple quiz that we've done are also linked in the description. So have some fun and good luck with whatever you're creating.